So I thought I'd just upload a little version of my conversation with Stephen, who is one of the most wonderful listeners that I've ever met. And I sat down with Stephen in a small living room in France in the middle of one of our round table sessions. And we talked for about 25 minutes about listening. And this is a little edit of that conversation. So for anyone who was at the story and heard a little bit of Stephen talking about listening, this is a little bit more of him. For anyone who wasn't, then this is just me and Stephen talking about listening. That's it. I hope you enjoyed.
What you're about to listen to is an edit created by the Dialogue Project, with the full permission of everyone involved in the conversation. If you can hear my voice clearly, the volume will be about right for you. Thank you for listening.
Can I ask you a specific question about listening?
Of course, please.
Who's the best listener that you know? What are some of the qualities of people that you've met? So we've talked earlier about examples.
Yes, in the philosophical world, one or two of the people who are both the old head of the philosophy school and the new philosophy school are wonderful listeners, and you know it immediately. So if you sit down, it's as if, first of all, you were the only thing in the world for them, and yet, but within that, there's this fantastic space. It's like an auditorium. It's so big, and the possibilities are endless. It's completely still. It's absolutely accepting. There's no...
And what's the it in that? Do you mean when you say it's completely still, it's...
Yes. That's the feeling you get, is what I suppose I mean. It's a sort of... maybe it's more than that. It's something that you share. It's sort of that. But it's not only that. It is actually both the dialoguers, if I could put it that way. The whole thing is contained in this space, and... actually, the real word is freedom. Absolute freedom. So you can say anything you want. There's you're not constrained, and you don't have to think, "Am I going to be?" You can just say what you, and then you recognise several things. One is this very great precision. Suddenly, you're speaking in a way which is precise, clear, conscious. And remarkably, it's formed in the substance of what's being said is beautifully formed.
And you notice that not as the listener, but the listened to.
You notice it. I suppose that's when listening and speaking become almost the same thing.
Yeah,
you can hear yourself, and except it isn't yourself. That's the other extraordinary thing. There's just this voice which is. And it's almost as if whoever's speaking, quite immaterial, whether who's speaking, there is a sound, and there's hearing. And I have known it to be as joined as that. I once went to the head of the philosophy school where I studied philosophy to ask, I think I mentioned the other day, this business about how I could combine a spiritual life with I was obliged to earn a living.
Yeah.
How many hours a day could I do one and the other? I'm halfway through the question. And the answer popped up, which is that they're completely compatible, and that you may follow the spiritual in Mammon, as it were, at the same. And I remember sitting with this chap. I was in this big. He was in a house near the Isle of Wight. Big drawing room with a fire, and he was sitting in this big room. Quite an imposing figure in a way, and yet I was sitting with someone as near to me and as close to me as I've ever known. It's very beautiful. I feel quite moved talking about it in a way, because in a way I was so close to him that I was talking to myself. And I remember having both spoken and answered the question, simply to be with this man. And I think I said quite a bit, actually. And there was this shared delight. You know, sometimes when you talk to someone you feel really close to, there's this beautiful, it's like a communion. And the act of share, the voice and what's being said is merely a medium for the act of a much deeper kind of sharing. And I remember it was just like that. And what arose was real joy, just real joy. And it wasn't arising in me, or it was just there in the room for both of us, you know. And it was a sort of as if we were both warming our hands in the light of the warmth of the fire.
So anyway, what you described there is seems so far removed from what we could call the conventional understanding of listening, that there's one person who is listening and the other person is either talking or explaining. So actually listening becomes listening and sharing there seem to be almost the same way.
Indeed so.
It's almost like we create something between us now that we're going to call listening.
Or something is created if given the right circumstances. It just arises. That's the feeling, that it is absolutely not to do with anything I've done. It, and perhaps if you could put it that way, it's to do with something I haven't done. Because one of the sort of philosophical ideas I find really interesting is that everything that speech to begins from silence. Like the phrases and the words I'm uttering now begin in silence, play on the stage and end. And they go back to silence, they arise from, and it's as if when you're really speaking and there's real listening, which in fact I mean the same thing there, what's more magic than what's being said is the silence that supports it all. And music, when that's heard too, when music's rarely heard, as I have found it is possible to hear, particularly when I have no idea I'm going to hear it.
How do you mean?
Because I haven't had time to form a kind of view that I'm going to be listening to music and I ought to get... There was a tramp who used to play in Soho years ago when I worked in Golden Square. And he played a flute. And he was actually pretty good. It was a bit of a beat, and he had a foot with a sort of clown's thing, a flap up and down there. But you could be walking at lunchtime, and you come round the corner, and this, because a flute has a particularly lovely sort of silver sound to it, silver instrument, silver sound, and these silver notes would splash off the buildings like water, and just for a moment there was absolute contact with the sound. And it was as if in a way, it was like being in heaven. It was so pure and so perfect, without any of the sort of superiority that perfection can normally mean. It was just beautiful. And also, once or twice, particularly I found at the beginning of listening to a symphony or so, I remember once, I'm very fond of Mozart, particularly played on instruments of the period. The Academy of Ancient Music, for example, is a very good, they play it wonderfully. And I remember going to an opera at Glyndebourne, and I didn't know it was the Academy of the Age of Enlightenment, I think. And they started it with the Magic Flute, and they started this beautiful, the prelude to it. Do I mean the prelude? I mean the
overture.
The overture. Thank you. And for the first 10 seconds, there was this, first of all, astonishment, I suppose, at the sound of this. Because the ancient instruments, they carry a purity. It's a bit squeaky, but they have a purity that modern instruments, they're much more mellifluous and velvet and brown and everything. This is much sort of more... First of all, I remember hearing the notes and thinking how lovely that they were. And then what I sort of felt was the silence out of which they were coming was the most magical thing.
Now, who creates that silence? In that situation, I mean, the conductor can raise his baton and the audience, there's an understood code of behaviour that now is our time to fall quiet, or at least to stop making noise. But is that the same as a silence?
No, nothing to do with that at all. Well, it's something to do with it, in that, one does need to... But this is stillness at a level that I've only ever known in meditation. which is utter stillness. There's nothing to do with what I ought to be doing. It is complete, and it's it is as the face of the world shines upon it. It's as wide as you could go. It underpins everything, all activity, all everything. There's something in sound, and in that instance, it was these beautiful, very pure sounds of the instrument. It was as if they were free to dance as they rarely were, untrammeled by anything.
So we're back to freedom.
They were back to freedom, and that's the word above all else that
Just keeps on
describes
coming
it,
back.
actually.
What
Listening enables.
Do you enable listening in others? Is that part of what you do?
Well, I must say I try. Actually, when I try, of course, I screw it up completely. But there are times when you can, and this is a lovely example because I see that you're a wonderful listener yourself.
Oh, can I just tell you what you just said? I see that you're a wonderful listener.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Can you explain what you mean by that?
I suppose I used "I see" in the sense of
I see
I
a voice.
appreciate, and I understand.
Right.
Well, I know you are. I know you are.
And okay, I'm going to push a bit harder. How do you know? How can you tell?
As I said the other day, the most obvious thing is that I find I'm saying things that I feel are quite magical, really. I mean, I don't mean that in any big... I don't mean it's me being clever. I just find I'm being articulate. And in a way, moderately precise here and there, in a way that I couldn't be if I wasn't being really listened to.
So you're understanding, or you're, as it were, assessing the quality of my listening. I'm not saying you're assessing it, but you understand that I'm a good listener in what your response to that is.
Entirely so. It is entirely the articulacy, as I can feel it to be now, and maybe behind that, what is apparent to me while I'm speaking to you is the sole indicator that you're a good listener. That's all.
Yeah.
Right. At least I think that's right. I wonder if it really... Certainly that's the very best measure I know, is that I am now speaking as I wouldn't normally speak, in a way. And it is because there is this sense of... you provide this stage on which one may turn, and really turn like I feel free. I feel like I feel myself, sort of way, and that's a lovely thing. And what a blessing.
So let's get back to you when you're listening. How consciously do you engage in that activity? Do you have to be in a particular frame of mind, or do you do it naturally sometimes, instinctively sometimes?
I find it's best. I'm not sure I'm a terribly good listener, actually, I have to say. I can recognise good listening in others. I'm not quite so sure. I find it quite difficult to take the doing out of listening. And that's because doing implies an activity, a movement, and listening, as I just said, is still. And I do find that sometimes quite difficult. But one tries to remember to be still. If I've meditated, perhaps I meditate. And sometimes the mind can be drawn to a point of great stillness, and that definitely carries a bit like being washed. You are washed, but then you're clean afterwards as well, and the mind can be very still then. You need to get completely out of your own way so that you're not interfering in the process, the chatter and all this stuff, the engine, which, funnily enough, good listening, first thing is when you are listening, is that you realise this goddamn machine, this engine, starts up within about 5 seconds of waking up, and it's going up like a kind of train, but you don't notice it most of the time. But when there is listening, you can notice it, and through, I could only describe it as grace sometimes, it just goes. So that one regards the person who's speaking, and perhaps more particularly what they're actually saying. Although I'm not sure there's actually a difference, to be totally honest. It is what's there, and there isn't anything else. So the stage, if you like, is free, completely free. And it's absolute magic. I mean, in a way, you could say it was the only evidence in a way, one needs is not of the hand of God, of the fact that for things to work properly, you just need to stop doing things. You just need to stop doing, stop interfering.
Stop interfering. I see. I love the collision between this idea, which I think I understand, and this phrase that's very popular now, which you must have heard, called active listening. You know, that actually, people say, well, the mistake everyone makes is that listening is just not doing anything. Listening is a very active thing. But that's kind of in contradiction to what you're saying, isn't it?
I think it is, very, very possibly. I think it's a contradiction in terms, actually. Clearly, in a conversation, there needs to be the odd and yes and interjection and everything. But when that arises, when that's called forth by the ebb and flow of the conversation, and it's just a very natural, that's one thing. But if you're sitting, I think I've got to do listening, and I must do all this kind of thing, so that it becomes a
task.
That just gets... I went to I took my aged uncle, a great mistake, to the Classic Brit Awards at the Festival Hall a little while ago. What I noticed there was that, what was completely apparent to everybody in a way, was that there was a lot of really lovely music played, but it wasn't sufficient on its own. So there were strobe lights and there was a bit more of a beat, and you had Nigel Kennedy playing in his wonderful way, but complete with fuckings and buggerings and drinking beer and lights playing in one. And this, see what it seemed to be saying is that what's actually the music is not anymore enough. We of the 21st century, we need, more, to put in more. And if ever I saw an example of gilding the lily, that was it. And I think there is an idea in society today, and active listening just sounds absolutely out of that stable, where it's not enough just to listen, or even to show that you're listening, but you have to kind of do something.
It's very important to be busy, isn't it?
Absolutely, because and that goes back to an idea: if you're not busy, you're nothing. I remember I used to work for the Samaritans for a little while, and we had a series of lectures, and there was one by Chadvara, the founder of the Samaritans, and he told this story of how he had this lady who was clearly very upset, sat down, and they sat down to have a dialogue, and she started. And he couldn't get a question in edgeways. For 2 hours he couldn't get a question in edgeways. He just went on and on and on. And then she stopped, and he wrote, "I saw my chance, I jumped at it, I said nothing." I said nothing. And she jumped up, apparently, so he told the story. 10 seconds later, shook him by the hand, said, "That's absolutely one of the best conversations I've ever had. Thank you for your advice." And went out.
And he said nothing.
He said nothing at all. But he'd been listening. It's a lovely thing, that, actually.
Fantastic. We have to stop talking, because we have to go and start talking.
That's amazing.
Isn't it great?
Quite seriously, I thought we'd done about 5 minutes.
And likewise.
I don't know that I've known 25 minutes go like that.
So far.
My whole life.
Wow.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you. And let me tell you exactly how long